So welcome to Maha. Lovely to have you in, learn a little bit about everything that you do and all the places that you have been teaching in, because I'm really interested in the different cultural responses to what you do. But first of all, can you just tell me kind of where you are right now, so people who are watching can kind of visualize where you're sitting in your home in the world?
Yes. Hi, everybody. I'm in Australia on the East Coast. So I'm about 10 or 11 hours drive north of Sydney. So close to the most easterly point of Australia, about 40 minutes north again of that place, which is Byron Bay, where I lived for 23 years and raised my children. And then I'm about 10 minutes from the Queensland, New South Wales border. So that gives a bit of an idea. And we are in lockdown again with one
like
case in the area.
Yeah.
So it's
and
a bit frustrating.
I imagine. I also ask people, sort of what's their heritage, because you were telling me that your work is really informed by your lineage.
So I'm of Palestinian Lebanese origin. My father was Palestinian, my mother Lebanese. And my father kidnapped me when I was 6 months of age and my brother 2.5, and brought us to Australia, unbeknown to our mum, who stayed in Beirut, and she didn't know where we were until I found her when I was 33. So it's a huge story that's underpinned my work on both sides, the maternal and paternal lineage of my, just not only my cultural roots, but the experience of being that mixture and that, childhood experience, or that baby experience of being taken from their mum. So that's a big story of mine. And I've woven that actually into my beautiful book, Dance of the Womb. So this is a world first book on belly dance for pregnancy and birth, but it's also an intimate story of my life. And I think that's what we find as time goes by. We realize that our work and what we do in the world and our voice in the world often has that anchor in that childhood, babyhood, even conception experience. And that comes through in our own births and birthing our own children.
So it sounds like the work that you've been doing with mothers and babies is somehow a reclamation of trying to bring something back from what was taken from you.
Yes.
Would that be right? Yeah.
And in some ways it is, because the premise of my work has always been to keep mothers and babies together. That mothers and babies are the experts, they carry the intelligence of birth, and they know what they are doing. And that is really what my work in Embody Birth, that I founded in 1997, is all about. And it's the journey that we go on, or that I've been on, to have that reclamation or that realization and that remembering that this is the reason I do what I do, because I am that baby. I am the product of the severance from my mother. And that is also part of the repair and the alchemy into that new story, that new way of being, which is what is also interwoven through my work in Embody Birth and BellydanceBirth. So it is like a dance of my life, the dance of the womb, integrated through this story, to write the new chapters of my story, which is personal and professional. So it's beautiful. And I'm 60 next year. So I've been doing this for 25 years. So when we, can see from an expanded, from the hilltop, looking down on our life and seeing that journey through the valleys and rivers of time, you can see it a little bit more clearly and understand, why have I done what I have done? Why am I so passionate about keeping mothers and babies together? And yes, it is seeded in my experience for sure. And it's beautiful. I love that. And we can take our stories, Tessa, and we can either collapse, which is sometimes a response to things. And there are times in our journey that we have to stop and take stock and be in that stillness. And then other times we rise and we alchemize the story into that gift, which is really what I've been incrementally doing, and then moving along that pathway through my own births and seeing the jewels shine upon others and sharing that in a very beautiful, feminine kind of, but strong, very strong way.
Before we hear more about your work, could you tell me a little bit about what you were like as a girl? I'm thinking about 10 years old. So
I was strong. I was strong, but I was also very sad because I was separated from my mother. I had a stepmom, but I always had this inner fire, this inner knowing, this intuitive strength that always lived inside of me. And I used to say it was like a candle flame connection to my mother that was burning bright. And my father was very, very strict, and he was abusive. So that's the sadness of being in that family dynamic with a father who was not nice, who was very disciplinary, coming from, you know, strong Middle Eastern background, and being in Australia. So I was in these two worlds. So it was difficult as a 10 to 12-year-old because I had this fire and this strength, but I was also suppressed and I wasn't able to express it. But I always danced. I always loved music and dance. So that kept me anchored and grounded. Listening to music and dancing was really my love. But I was a bit of a tomboy too. I had an older brother. So at that age, I was, you know, skateboarding with him, bike riding, playing cricket outside, you know, swimming. So very, as we would say, tomboy, but I was always very athletic as well, very athletic, you know, very strong on many levels. And so I lived again in these two worlds of kind of suppression and strength.
Yeah. And so the dancing, did you immediately sort of, were you belly dancing because of the culture that you'd come from, or did you start with some other kind of dance and then find your way?
Just my own dancing. Yeah,
okay, like in your bedroom, putting some music on,
and the singing and the dancing. Yeah, and oh, look at me, everybody, look at me, and I'm still doing that at nearly 60. Look at me. But I thought music has always kept me grounded, and having that, you know, connection to rhythm and song and dance, and all of that kept me, that part of me, alive. And you know, I love dancing and music.
Yeah, well, it can be so grounding, can't it? I mean, I know if I feel agitated, I'll put some music on, and I've got some, you know, maybe 3 tracks that I know if I put that on, one of those, and start dancing, that agitation will just go. Yeah, it's so transformative.
Yeah, but one day I was actually about that age. I think you've just reminded me now. I think I was about 10, and was with my stepmother was very young, and she had a sister who was my age, and we used to dance around together when she visited. And I remember one time we got up on the coffee table in front of my dad, and my dad glared at me and said, "Get down, get to your room." And I remember that feeling of, I will never have that taken out of me, no matter what you say. You know, I'll dance on another table. I'll find another table to dance on. So I was very determined, very good at school. I got all the high marks at school. So I was an all-round, very diligent and strong kid internally, but having to deal with difficulty, being of a different culture in Australia. And when I was, Tessa, 10, that was 1972, Australia, racist Australia. So there weren't many people of Middle Eastern origin, you know, or other cultures. So we're talking early on. And, you know, sometimes people thought I was of Aboriginal background in the way we've been treating Aboriginal people in Australia at that time. Terrible, terrible stories. So I really understood that I was of a different culture and a different colour to the majority. And that wasn't easy in Australia. I don't often talk about all of that time, but that can, again, you either grow stronger or you can collapse from that. But for me, somehow I grew stronger and more determined. Yeah.
So tell me a bit about how you came to this work, because it sounds like you'd always been dancing, but this focusing around birth came a bit later.
Yeah, so I had actually tried to conceive for many years, and I found my mum in Lebanon when I was 32, and I met her when I was 33. And having trying to conceive for 5 years, and 6 months after meeting my mum, I got pregnant. And I had a huge realization of that dance of life, that it wasn't just a physical ailment, but it was something connected to an emotional disconnection that had been repaired to meet my mum. And then I got pregnant with my son actually in England, in London, with my first husband, who was English. And I couldn't believe that I had got pregnant in England. I arrived, and 2 weeks later I was pregnant after all these years. And it had been 6 months since I met my mum, and all I wanted to do was come back to Australia, and we were going to travel the world and do all of these things. But I ended up coming back to Australia at 27 weeks, and we had a beautiful pregnancy support group in Byron Bay, which is a gorgeous community, very progressive community. You may have heard of it in Australia. Yeah. And it's not so much now, it's just a big tourist, rich people's town, but it was beautiful in that time. Aboriginal women's birthing place. There was an Aboriginal women's birthing lake. It's just a stunning place. Yeah, the sea, the ocean, and the mountains, beautiful. And I was pregnant with my first son. We came there after England, and there was a beautiful pregnancy support group. And in that group, there was a midwife who was teaching some movements of belly dancing. And I came into the group 27, 28 weeks pregnant, and I could do all the movements very easily. And I used some of the movements in labor, and it was like it triggered the memory of where I came from. And my Palestinian grandmother, who'd given birth to 9 babies in our birthing house, which I've written about in my book. And all this came flooding through my body. Yeah, so on a somatic level, the memory was released. And then when my son was 6 months of age, this midwife asked if I'd like to take over the class because she was moving to a different place. And I said, sure. And I didn't know what I was doing, but I knew what I was doing. And I just trusted the transmission. And I created these classes, Oriental Dance for Birth, and mothers would just start coming. And I'd have my son on my hip, and we'd be dancing and moving, beautiful music playing. And it was just this free expression of, you know, pregnancy dance. And it just grew, Tessa, over the years. And it became really popular. And then I kind of started to format it a little bit into, you know, the circle movement, the figure 8 movement, the spiral, the hands and the arms and all of those things. And then 25 years later, I've traveled the world teaching. It's amazing. So tell me,
as you were talking about how you'd started to teach in China before the pandemic took hold. So what was your experience of that?
Well, it was funny because probably 15 years before I was invited to China, I had this little voice in my head that was saying, you need to go to China because their cesarean rate was so high. And then I think it was 2015, the government told the mothers, you can now have 2 babies. And that's when China started to open up to international teachers and wanted to know more about physiological, natural, gentle birth. Barbara Harper has been there many times from Water Birth. And the sponsor that brought me to China was very interested in hypnobirth and, you know, natural childbirth, or as nature intended childbirth. And she saw me on YouTube, on my YouTube channel, you know, talking about my work, and just was mesmerized and loved everything I said and contacted me. So that's how I got to go to China. And so the first time I went was 2017. And the women were so receptive, and the hospitals, especially the private hospitals, really embracing me as a mentor and my work in Embody Birth and BellydanceBirth. They loved the whole dance aspect. And, it's a dance of energy as well. So they have all the Tai Chi.
Yeah.
And I would say you already.
Yeah.
Yeah, you already have that movement, but not necessarily applied to the prenatal pregnancy birth preparation. And so I was so fortunate, Tessa, over the next 3 years, I went to many, many hospitals, and I went to Shanghai and Taizhou, Guangzhou, other places in China. And I met the most amazing, beautiful doctors, obstetricians, midwives, pregnant mums. I mean, I spoke at the Shandong Midwifery Association as a keynote speaker one year in 2018. I was speaking to 2,000 midwives at once. Extraordinary to stand on the stage, and be amongst that many midwives, very receptive and open to learning. And then I would be, on a stage, I don't even know where, in a city somewhere, and there'd be big cameras and they would be transmitting my lecture, all to 6 different places in China, thousands of pregnant women. It was amazing, amazing. And I loved it. And I was just building my reputation and my work and the knowledge of my work. And then 2020, beginning of 2020, the walls came down, and I was so upset because I think by then I'd been 5 times. So I was getting ready to go the 6th time. Yeah. And yeah, it's been hard, but they are translating my online program. They're translating my book. They've just finished translating all the dance chapters from my video series, Dance of the Womb. So that's great. That's going to be coming out it's already come out this year, and the online program next year. So it's been amazing, really incredible. And as I was saying to you before, yeah.
So I guess I'm really interested in the fact that it's the hospitals that were very interested in your work. I'm talking in generalizations now, but I think in the UK, there are lots of midwives who are interested in, and training in hypnobirthing and biomechanics and perhaps dancing as well, but it doesn't tend to be so much the obstetricians. It's very much the midwives who want to be women-centered, or independent people who, for whatever reason, have an interest in supporting women. So yeah, it's very interesting that in China there was this hunger from the medical community.
Yes, yeah, and that surprised me as well, Tessa. I too was very surprised at that. And it's interesting how we have ideas about what an obstetrician looks like, or what their posture, who they are. And sometimes I'd have these women look very young girls, and they were obstetricians. It was amazing, and they were only in their mid-20s or late 20s, or really still in that phase of wanting to learn and grow and make transformation. I think they knew that in China there's been a very high C-section rate, as mentioned, and I think they know somewhere deep down that we want to change these practices. So they still do have certain parameters within which the hospital has to operate. But some of these larger private hospitals, they are a business. So to them, bringing in a mentor or a teacher who has a particular ideology or program will only benefit their hospital, even though it's a business model, but there is still that embracing of the ideas, and the new programs coming in, and they want to be able to offer that to the pregnant mothers, which is beautiful, because I don't find that in Australia, or as you said, the UK. The Western countries are not so embracing of these ideas. I think there's more regulation and protocols, and that's what I loved about China, is that openness. So I'll be back. I'll go back. Can't keep me away from China. I loved it.
I also wanted to ask how cycles have affected your work over the years, and that might be menstrual cycles, it might be the lunar cycle, seasons, because I think when we start to think about living in a cyclical way, it becomes more sustainable. So I think it's useful to think about all the different ways that cycles affect us. But How can you speak to that?
Well, it's interesting because a lot of this work on cycles has really escalated, I'd say, in the last sort of 5 years, more and more. And I don't know that I was consciously conscious of it. I think for me, I'm more a lunar cycle, that I am more, triggered by what the moon is doing. And I know, when the full moon is, I feel very alive and full of ideas and projects. But I've never really consciously, examined what that looks like. But I feel inherently and intuitively that it is the moon that affects me. And now I am 5.5 years post-menopause, so no longer shedding the blood, holding on to the blood, which for me is building the liberation. Because for me, the voice, my true voice of who I am in this post-menopause time is getting stronger and stronger. So that living blood that is retained within me is what I feel has grown in strength and power. And it's interesting with the menopause too, because there's not so much in the menstrual cycling. Obviously, there is no menstrual cycle, and there isn't this kind of up and down anymore. What I find is it's much more steady, and that is a cycle. Subtle, but strong. As the years go on, the strength builds, and the trust in the transmission is very strong for me now. And there is always this element that I've heard in women who are post-menopause, that I don't care what anybody thinks anymore. I don't need to be loved or liked anymore. What I need to do is speak my truth, without worrying. And if someone listens, that's good. If they don't, that's good. If I get attacked, it doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is I'm living in my truth. And I think that cycling of steadiness has built that. And it's a beautiful time. And not to say I didn't have some, had a couple of years of, difficulty, because I breastfed my daughter, who I had at 46. I breastfed her 8.5 years to natural term. So I breastfed till I was 54.5, or breast nurtured. So a year post-menopause. And in that time, there was a different cycling. And then when I stopped breastfeeding, I actually crashed, adrenal fatigue. And that has taken me 2.5 years to really build back. My boys are now 21 and 24, so they've got their own life. So I'm just with my daughter now. She's 12, nearly 13. And it took me a while to get through that time.
Yeah, because increasingly, in my pregnancy yoga classes, I have many women who are in their early 40s. And, then there's the situation where as you're coming into your perimenopause, you're dealing with postnatal hormones and the perimenopause maybe. It's interesting to hear your experience that perhaps the breastfeeding hormones were keeping you sort of at a certain point, and then interesting.
Interesting, isn't it? And I think that the crash I had was coming from adrenal fatigue, which we know postmenopausally the adrenals take over the production of the hormones, and the estrogen, the progesterone, because the ovaries have stopped. And I think I got a triple whammy from that drop, even though it was a slow release of the breastfeeding and the breast nurturing, but that closeness, the oxytocin as well, the dopamine. I think there were other hormones, the endorphins as well, and then the letting go after such a long time. So there was a lot of adjustment there. And I couldn't handle everything. I couldn't handle stress anymore. I just didn't have that cushioning. So it was an interesting time. But I don't regret that. I'm really happy that I breastfed my daughter to natural term, and she's an amazing young girl, and I'm just so blessed. And I wanted to see, a child that was consciously conceived through pregnancy and the birthing, and then the post-birth and the breastfeeding. Let her just be. And I'm so glad that I have. and I can share that experience.
And I love that term, breast nurturing. I think that's super important. Yeah, it is that comfort as well.
Absolutely.
I think it's really important to talk about that. Why should that be something, you know, I'm still in a few breastfeeding sort of Facebook groups, and unfortunately see mums saying, oh, I'm getting pressure from family, pressure from my husband or whoever it might be. Yeah. It's only for comfort now. So
only? That's huge.
Is that a big deal?
That's huge. That's right. We have a very strange society, Tessa. As I said, I was the second woman in the world to stand up for natural term breastfeeding and breastfeeding an older child from 2012 to 2016, before it was fashionable, before anyone was really doing it. There was a couple of women in the UK who came on as well, and a couple in the US, but we were this very small contingent. And the media was so negative and diminishing the experience and wanting to, you know, sever us from the experience and sensationalize the experience, and just ridiculous that a mother breastfeeding her child could cause such division. But now in 2021, when I look out to the world and I see what's happening, I can clearly see the steps that have led us to here. But I stood very, very strong in my own power, in my own voice, in my own choice. And that's what it is. And it's that intuitive connection between a mother and her baby, her child. And people, for some reason, get very, very triggered by breastfeeding. It's extraordinary. It's extraordinary what it does to people deep down. Yeah, it really stirs the pot. I
mean, fortunately, when I'm teaching my mother and baby classes, the times that this happens is quite rare, where, say, somebody's gone into town and they've gone to a cafe and they're feeding, and then somebody comes and says something very negative. It tends to be rare, but it has always been an older woman. And I find that very interesting, that they are so triggered. And I wonder whether it, you know, perhaps they didn't breastfeed their children or breast nurture their children. And so that on a subconscious level, there's a reaction around that mothering that didn't happen in that way. So I think it's quite complex, and you know, hopefully we'll shift more and more as we see more people just very comfortably breastfeeding out and about. And more and more babies are coming through that have been breastfed to some degree, some length or other.
Well, I used to breastfeed my daughter in public. She was 6 or 7. Didn't bother me, you know, didn't bother me. But I didn't carry that energy of being bothered. Not that these women are carrying that energy, but I was just very natural. And it's very subtle as well. It's the way people carry on. It's as though we are, you know, doing this to show off or look at me or any of that kind of thing. But when you're actually in the zone, in that breastfeeding, breast nurturing zone, you're not consciously thinking about it. It's like you might go and make your child a sandwich or get them, you know, a juice or something. It's the same thing that you're doing. It's just taking care of them in this particular way. It's the media and the other that sensationalizes it and draws attention to it, actually, not really the mothers. I
wanted to ask you one last question, which was, and it sounds like there's been lots of transformational moments, but can you tell us about one transformational moment around your calling where something shifted for you?
Many, 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 but what comes straight to mind is my daughter's birth, my home birth at 46. And there was a moment in her birth, and I talk about this in my training actually, but I won't go into it, but there was a moment where I understood implicitly, innately, on a deep primal level, that birth is about raising consciousness for humanity. The way we birth is the way we raise and evolve humanity and heal humanity. And so many women are being robbed of the experience. And it was through that moment in her birth, which was a very powerful thing that happened to me, I woke up and I said, from now on forward, this is my teaching, that we birth in our freedom and in our power and in our self-reference, sovereign autonomy to raise consciousness for humanity. This is the way to bring love and compassion, connection, empathy to this planet through birth. And that's where a lot of my teachings changed. That was nearly 13 years ago.
Yeah, when you said raise consciousness, I got goosebumps.
Yes, and that's what I teach in Embody Birth and BellydanceBirth. It's not just about teaching a movement. It's a deeper movement for humanity, of moving us toward, not away from, love through birth.
So where can people find you?
So you can find me my website, mahalmusa.com, MahaAlMusa.com. I'm on Instagram, Maha_Al_Musa. And you can find me on Facebook, Maha Al Musa, Embody Birth Educator. But really through my website and Instagram are the two main places. And I do counselling all over the world. I've got a beautiful online birth preparation program. I've got my book and my video series and counselling. I think I said that. And I've got my virtual training coming up in October. So all of my online, everything has become now in the online platform. So my 4-day in-person training is now online certification. So it's exciting. I finally got my head around bringing my work fully online. So yeah.
Well, thank you
that's
so
been
much.
a big thing.
It's been amazing to hear something of your incredible journey.
Thank you, Tessa. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
We say in Embody Birth, Mama stay.
Mama stay.
Yes.